All right, we're going to pick up where we left off last time, moving into what will become the American Revolution. The colonies are going to be in a little bit of turmoil after the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, as they would call it over in England. Indeed, English society as a whole is going to be in a little bit of turmoil. There's going to be a lot of social unrest. Governments will rise and fall in England quite steadily. And when we talk about that, when we talk about a government rising or falling, it's a little bit different than we think of it. We tend to think of governments rising and falling with presidential elections. For example, this past presidential election, a Republican became president. The president before had been a Democrat. And so we think of the Democratic government as falling and the Republican government as rising or coming into being. The same thing happens in Great Britain when you have a prime minister. When somebody is named a prime minister, they establish a government, and when that person steps down or dies or is removed from office, they become, or that government falls. That's going to happen a lot during this period because of all the social problems going on in England. We're not going to cover all of them because this is really focusing on American history. And primarily what I want us to see as we are moving towards independence, getting ready for the American Revolution, are some of the key political players, government officials, that are going to be causing trouble between the colonies and between Great Britain. So what we have behind us right here is a map of the colonies roughly after the 7 Years' War, after the French and Indian War. And what I want us to focus on, or what I want us to see, is here's the colonies that we mostly think of right here along this stretch. But all of this was English colony. Right? But we tend, when we say the American colonies, we tend to think of these 13 colonies right there. And what I would like to remind you, we talked before about royal and private colonies and corporate colonies. The only corporate colony on this map right now is the Hudson Bay Colony. That's up here at the top of the map, the Hudson Bay Colony. Then you have two private colonies. You have Pennsylvania. Right here will be a private colony. And then just to the south of Pennsylvania, you have Maryland, which will be another private colony. And if you remember, Pennsylvania had a lot of the Germans would come and settle in Pennsylvania. A lot of the Quakers or Congregationalists are in Pennsylvania. And then Maryland was largely a Catholic colony. And so those two private colonies tend to have a lot of religious emphasis. And in particular, pacifist emphasis in those two colonies. It will be difficult to get people from those colonies to kind of get on board with the idea of fighting anybody for quite some time until after the 7 Years' War. So again, I said we're going to be focusing on some of the people this time. We're going to be looking at people like this guy. His name is William Pitt. All right, William Pitt is going to play a fairly significant role later on because of what he doesn't do. Right now, leaving the French and Indian War, William Pitt, you can see, was the Secretary of State for much of the time during the 7 Years' War, right, so from 1757 to 1761. And it was a lot of his policies that kind of got England in trouble. I think he had good policies, and his idea was that if you're going to fight a war, you should win the war. But his desire to win and totally defeat the French, not just in the colonies, right? We tend to think of the French and Indian War happening in the colonies, but it was a worldwide conflict. He wanted to defeat the French completely, so that they would have an absolute victory. But doing this incurs a huge expense because he has to put naval flotillas, he has to put ships all over the world, he has to put soldiers all over the world, and he's going to increase the garrison in the New World, the number of British soldiers over in the New World, to over 50,000, to the point where there are more British soldiers in the New World, in the colonies, than there are French colonists in all of New France. So France is then going to have to send soldiers over, and it's going to become a much bigger fight because William Pitt wants to win this total war. But his thinking was, if you're going to fight, then fight and try to win. So he's going to also spend money, not only incurring expenses fighting, but he's also going to be paying people, bribing them, or helping allies start other fights, in particular Prussia, which will later become Germany. So he's going to be sending Prussia money to begin fighting France on continental Europe. So he's going to kind of create a two-front war for France, two huge fronts, one in Europe and one over in the colonies, and it's going to be a very difficult and very expensive war for France to fight. So these policies are ultimately going to win. England wins the 7 Years' War, and they annex a ton of territory. So now they have a much larger empire to manage, which is going to bring some of its own problems. But during this, some of the changes that England is going to make after the war, they've just fought a long 7-year conflict that was incredibly expensive. The people home in England are footing the bill, by and large, and since they are sending their children to die, and since they are paying for the war, they're going to want some say about what happens with the new territories, and even with the old territories. And so they're going to begin instituting a more direct rule by Parliament. Right? For the longest time, they have allowed the colonies over in the New World to govern themselves. Right? The British government is kind of out of the way. Right? They're almost absent, by and large, from the day-to-day running of the colonies. But now, almost all the colonies, remember there's just 3, the Hudson Bay Colony way over in Canada, Pennsylvania and Maryland, that are private colonies. Otherwise, they're all royal colonies. And the royal colonies are going to begin to be ruled directly by Parliament. They're going to kind of get their fingers into everything. And the Americans are not going to like that. They have enjoyed ruling themselves for a very long time. It's also going to result in the deployment of regular military. Right? Now they are going to be sending more and more British soldiers over to the territory in North America, not only to keep peace, but also to defend it from what they thought originally would be a rebellion in Canada. It's kind of funny. But they thought originally that the French-Canadian population would rebel and try to either start their own country or go back to France. They didn't know it was going to happen, so they dramatically increase the number of regular military personnel, at least in the early 1760s, to quell what they thought would be a rebellion from the Canadians. Turns out they had that all wrong. Another interesting thing that you see, and you can see it happening with our government today, is the growth of government. The government in England swells, right? The number of officials, the number of bureaucrats, the number of offices. And as your government gets bigger, it takes more and more money and more time and more difficulty to make the government function. It becomes a bureaucratic mess. And that is slowly and steadily what is happening to the government over here. It will eventually get to a point where it just really doesn't work right anymore. And England will have highs and lows in its government efficiency, but this is a point where it's kind of becoming bloated, and it will have to figure out how to deal with all of these new problems. In order to fund or deal with the expenses, right, this is an interesting figure. At this time, in 1763, 1764, 60% of England's total revenue was going to pay for the French and Indian War, for the 7 Years' War. And so the English wanted to find a way to ease that. They wanted to get new money to not only pay off their debts, but hopefully to continue expanding. And they would do that by taxing the poor and the middle classes, who they called the middlings. Why would they do that? Well, because Parliament, by and large, is made up of wealthy landowners. And the wealthy landowners certainly don't want to increase taxes on themselves, so they cut property taxes out, right? They didn't end them, but they didn't really increase taxes on property because that's what all the nobles have. What they did is they increased taxes on goods. They increased taxes on imports and exports, on day-to-day manufacturing. Those are the things they taxed, and all that does in this culture, in this time, is really hurt the poorest people and the middlings who are doing the production. And so it is kind of a case of taxation without representation. Now you can make the argument that over in England, yes, those people had representation, but not really. You have these people who are looking out for their own interests, and it's going to wind up bad. When government looks out for its own interests, it creates political unrest. And that's going to happen. Again, we mentioned, all throughout this time period, England's governments are going to be rising and falling. And it's not necessarily people like William Pitt's fault. It's just kind of the whole system. Right? William Pitt actually was a decent statesman. He had good ideas. He was the Secretary of State. He was the Prime Minister in 1766 to 1768. And he was compassionate, right? He felt bad for the colonists over in America. He wanted to repeal some of the things that were making the colonists angry. So Americans in particular ought to, feel kindly toward people like William Pitt. But all of the things that were happening caused a lot of political unrest, not just in England, but also over in the colonies, as we'll see as we continue looking at some of the interesting people from today's lesson. This man's name is George Grenville. He will be prime minister from 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War, to 1765, for not too long, but for long enough. He was also the chancellor of the exchequer for the same time, which is a cabinet-level position, right? It's kind of like the treasurer. You can think of it like that. And so not only is he in charge of Parliament, but he is also going to be part of the cabinet. And so he is going to be a pretty influential person at this point in time. And what he wants to do is reform the empire. He looks out and he sees that the British Empire is not being run with British efficiency. It's not being run with British authority, with British structure. And he wants to fix it so that things work the way they're supposed to. And one of the primary problems throughout history is governments dealing with finances. And he thought that it was fair that the colonists should help foot the bill that protected them, that kept them safe. And so he thought that the colonists should pay also for the military. Up until this point, the bill is largely footed by the people living in England, and they have been using the colonies not for revenue, but for production. So they've been using the colonies to make things. The British had some islands in the Caribbean, and they had lots and lots of sugar production. And the sugar production gives you not only sugar products, but also things like alcohol. And so they're making a lot of money from those islands in the Caribbean. Well, they're getting other things, cotton, tobacco, all sorts of goods from the colonies in what will become the United States. And they are looking to produce, not necessarily to tax. And so as we think about things like fabric, timber, and those types of things, England up until this point had been looking to the colonies more as a resource rather than as a revenue source, and this man wants to change that. And so he also wants stricter control over the colonial regions. And what we're talking about is courts, basically. Up until this time, the colonists had their own courts. They were trial by jury, and he wants to put something in called vice admiralty courts, which we'll talk about in just a minute. He's also going to establish these new taxes through Parliament. So he's not just going to decide to do things, he's going to make the authority of Parliament over the colonies his battleground. He believes that Parliament has the right to tax any part of the British Empire. That Parliament has the right to make rules for any part of the British Empire. And so that's really what the battle is going to become about. It's not going to be about taxation necessarily. It's going to be about whether or not Parliament's authority trumps the authority of the local colonial governments. Because if you remember, the colonial governments have houses of representatives. And now the question is, who has the right to determine things like taxes? Who has the right to determine laws, to determine courts? And George Grenville is going to say it's Parliament. Parliament has the right to do that. All of you are British subjects. This is the way the British government works. You will match the British government. And so he does this, and one of the ways he does this is by passing the Sugar Act of 1764. There's going to be lots of acts, so you really need to pay attention to the names that are used, because the ones that we talk about, there's going to be some we don't talk about, but the ones we talk about are important, and you should remember them. What this does is this is going to tax trade with the French islands. There are some people who wanted no trade with the French islands in the Caribbean right now, and you could understand that, having just fought a war with the French. But even during the French and Indian War, some of the American colonies were trading with the French in the Caribbean. And so one English statesman said, we have one colony fighting the French and another colony funding the French. We can't have that. And so a lot of the people in Parliament wanted to completely cut off trade with the French entirely. Well, George Grenville recognized that was a bad idea because the islands and the colonies, they interacted well, and they both had things the other needed. And so instead of cutting off trade entirely, he just taxed it heavily. And so he saw this as a way to gain revenue from trade that both of those groups down there needed. And in addition, he also is going to try and cut down on the smuggling that takes place, and this is going to make some of the Americans really hot. You may know a guy by the name of John Hancock. John Hancock didn't always make his money on the level. Right? He made a lot of money by smuggling, by avoiding paying taxes, by getting molasses from Canada and refining it and using it and doing other things. And so the sugar tax is really kind of putting the pressure on people like John Hancock. And if you go and look at the Declaration of Independence, whose signature is the biggest? Mr. Hancock. Why? Because they hurt his wallet. And one of the sad facts of history is that a lot of the people that we might look up to as heroes don't always have the noblest of intentions. Again, like we talked about last time, if you can follow the money, you can normally tell why things are happening. Not always, but many times, if you can see how people are affected monetarily, you will see why people behave certain ways. And this is going to be true with a variety of the big figures from the American Revolution that we will talk about next time, or at least introduce next time. So we talked about these vice admiralty courts. Well, what were they? In many places, most of the colonies, they had trial by jury. And this goes back, English common law forever. In fact, the English colonists will even quote pieces of the Magna Carta, which is a document from the 13th century or the 1200s, and they will quote that to defend their trials by jury. And a vice admiralty court is basically a panel of a few officials, and they determine what happens. They would be British royal officials who hear court cases instead of courts going to trial by jury. And the reason why he wanted this is because he wanted British officials over the smuggling cases. Up until this point, the Americans would either bribe whoever was in charge, or many times they would be let off by the jury. The American colonists would say, well, I might find myself in the hot seat one day, so I'm going to let this guy off. And so they kind of had each other's back. Well, George Grenville wanted to stop that. And so he wanted these vice admiralty courts put in place so that British control over trade and over the colonies would be strengthened. Because this problem that we're seeing coming to a head that ultimately is going to lead to the American Revolution is who has the authority to decide things like taxation, and who has the authority to decide who will be in charge directly, either through governance or through the judiciary. Who gets to decide? Who gets to make the laws, who gets to enforce the laws, and who gets to judge the laws? That's what a lot of this discussion is about. And people like George Grenville thought Parliament did. Parliament got to have direct control over the colonies, and the colonists felt like they should have control over their own lives. So that's going to kind of lead us up then to this, the Stamp Act of 1765. And basically what the Stamp Act was another attempt to generate revenue. And this is a shift in British policy. This is important to remember. It's a change from viewing the colonies as a production resource to viewing the colonies as a revenue resource. And the colonists were fine producing things. The colonists didn't mind sending goods and raw materials over to England. They were okay with that. But as soon as you start messing with their money, they get mad. And the same thing, by and large, is true with people today. Right? If the government wants to put tariffs or taxes on things that we make and things that we buy, that's one thing. But people get very, very upset when you start messing around with their money. When you start messing around with their money, they get very upset. All right, we'll just leave it there. Same thing here. These stamps had to be put on all official documents. Right, this is the Stamp Act of 1765. They have to be put on all official documents, all letters, all papers, and all newspapers. So anything basically with paper has to have a stamp on it, one of these official stamps. And it was a way of generating revenue. They imagined it would generate a lot of revenue, a ton of revenue. And so you're dealing with a significant amount of money from a smaller section of the population, right? Professionals. The people who would have the money to pay, they also have the money to fight. And that's pretty much what's going to take place. But it raises again this question, can Parliament tax the colonies? Well, people like George Grenville believed that they could. And he made it a point by going to Parliament, and he asked the question to the House, or to the House of Commons, and he would say, who can argue that Parliament doesn't have the right to tax the colonies of the British Empire? And most people there thought that he did, except for one guy, in particular one guy, and his name was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was over there discussing these things at the time, and Benjamin Franklin had the idea, well, why don't we allow the colonists to elect representatives to sit in Parliament? And then they can be part of the discussion. And you know, frankly, looking back at everything that happens, if they had accepted Benjamin Franklin's proposal at this point in time, America might still be a British, Commonwealth. Right? Eventually probably would have become its own country, so to speak, similar to the way that Queen Elizabeth is the Queen of Canada. She's also the sovereign of Australia, right? But Australia and Canada are their own countries. That's probably what would have happened with the United States. Something like that. I don't know what it would have looked like if Canada and the U.S. would have been one thing, who knows. But had they listened to him and given them representation, history might be very different. But they didn't. It was absurd to most of the people sitting in Parliament to think that American colonists could know anything about the way the British government ought to function properly. Their job was to produce things, and it was the British job, the Parliament's job, to run things, and that wasn't going to change. Another person there who supported Benjamin Franklin was our good friend, William Pitt. He thought that was a smashing idea. He threw all his support behind it. Again, I told you, he felt for the American colonists, for their situation. He was compassionate toward them, but there wasn't enough support. It's almost a unanimous decision that we're not going to do that, and that we're going to pass this Stamp Act, and we're going to go and we're going to start getting revenue from the colonies instead of using them as a means of production. And that is going to result in bad things, right? It's going to result in riots. And we're not going to cover all of the riots that happen because there's a lot. There are many, many riots that happen, and most of them at this point up before 1770, so 1770 and before, many of the riots are going to be about these stamps. It really makes people angry. And the riots get so intense that at one point, one of the governors runs to General Gage, who is in charge of the British military in the North American colonies, and he's going to ask him to get the military out to fight the crowd, to subdue the crowd. And he said, we could disperse the crowd, but we will not subdue their will. And so wisely, General Gage refuses to go out and begin what he knew would be a civil war. He knew if we go out in full force with the military and we begin shooting the colonists, that we're going to have a civil war. And despite the fact that there were people like General Gage and William Pitt who refused to fall headlong into conflict, there are enough agitators that eventually we're going to get there. All right, so you have things like this where people are rioting, where they're going and they're stealing all the stamps, where they are forcing government officials, basically saying, take this or we'll kill you, forcing government officials to take documents without the stamps. And so Parliament is getting a lot of pushback from these stamps. And it's going to kind of create a division over in Parliament to the point where we have people like this guy. His name is Charles Townsend. And he is going to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, again, kind of the treasurer. And the reason why he is important is because of one of the odd twists of history. Sometimes in history, things happen not because they're planned, but because of unforeseen circumstances. A lot of history's greatest stories and some of history's greatest failures are due to odd twists. For example, notice how Charles Townsend is not the Prime Minister. Well, there's a reason why. He wouldn't have done a good job, right? He's just not the man for the job at the time. But William Pitt was the Prime Minister, and he was struggling with illness at the time. He missed many of the debates, he missed many of the sessions, and so who stands in for the Prime Minister? The Chancellor of the Exchequer. So basically, he's the Prime Minister sometimes. And while William Pitt really was sympathetic toward the colonists, Charles Townsend was not. He felt like the colonists were rebelling against imperial will. He felt like the colonists were conducting themselves in a way unbecoming of British subjects by rejecting and rebelling and fighting against the orders and the laws of Parliament. They shouldn't do that. British subjects should obey Parliament, was his view. And so he is going to seek to impose quite strongly imperial will upon the colonists. And he's going to publish, or he's going to be behind or start what is called the Townsend Act. And it looks like Townshend, but it's Townsend, right? Townsend. Townsend Act of 1767. And basically what this does is it starts taxing imports to the colonies. So the colonies, again, before all this started, were seen as, resource production. They sent things out to Great Britain. And Great Britain would send back some things, some manufactured goods, refined things. Now, those imports into the colonies are going to be taxed. So the colonists are going to have to pay even more taxes. And this money, which this is really kind of the kicker, the money was going to be used to support the government officials so that they didn't depend upon the colonists for their paycheck. If you control somebody's money, you really have a lot of influence over what they do. And the issue was that England could appoint government officials, but the government officials got their paycheck from the colonial governments. And so now Townsend says, well, we're going to tax everything going into the colonies, and that money, which again was going to be a significant sum of money, that money is going to be used to pay the government officials so that the colonists can't bribe them, and so that the colonists can't hang a paycheck over their head. It really frees up the government officials to do the king's will, which is a great idea. The only problem is the colonists hate it. He's also going to be behind the Revenue Act of 1767. The Revenue Act of 1767. This is going to create customs boards to enforce the taxing on the imports of goods. And so really it's giving teeth to the laws that are already in place and to the Townsend Act of 1767. It's also going to create additional courts to deal specifically with people who refuse to pay taxes, for people who refuse to follow the laws of the Parliament, in particular dealing with imports, exports, tariffs, and taxes, and all of those good things. And so he's giving a lot of authority and a lot of direct control to British government officials. He is taking authority and control away from colonial courts and away from colonial representative assemblies, and he is placing that power solely in the hands of the British governing officials. And the colonists are not going to like that. Well, now we've got this last guy that we're going to look at. He's the final person we're going to talk about. His name is Frederick North. He's often called Lord North. Lord is not a nickname, it's a title. Right? He was amongst the gentry over in England, and he was a lord, and so people would refer to him by his title, Lord North. And so you'll most often see him referred to as Lord North, but his name is actually Frederick. And he, again, is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Treasurer, and he is also the Prime Minister from 1770 to 1782. So he will be the Prime Minister for 12 years, and much of the time that the American Revolution is taking place. It begins in 1775, arguably maybe in a year before that. So 1775 up to 1783, and he will be Prime Minister for most of that time. Lord North wanted to save the empire. He realized that everybody is hurtling headlong into rebellion, into a civil war. And he didn't want that. And so he was a very persuasive, very practical politician, and he persuaded Parliament to revoke the import taxes, to get rid of the Townsend Acts, and to get rid of a lot of the things that had been done before. And his hope was that by alleviating the burden on the colonies, people had felt some intense pressure from Parliament and from the British government. So if he could take that pressure away, even though he's not going to take it all the way away, because there was so much burden, if he took a large portion of it away, his hope was that people would kind of ease back into something more than they had before the 7 Years' War. And so, again, a master politician, he's trying to appease both sides. There are people who want the colonists to pay taxes, and the colonists don't, so how do you make them both happy? He had some really good ideas. So he's able to do this and persuade Parliament to revoke the import taxes. He does keep the tax on tea. It's going to be important later because we're going to have the Boston Tea Party, right? So he keeps the tax on tea for symbolic reasons, largely to symbolize the fact that Parliament has the right to tax the colonies. Parliament is in charge, and by keeping that tariff or that tax on the teas, he makes sure that the colonies know that Parliament is in charge. And at this point, because his plan works, at this point the colonists are so glad that some of the burden is gone, they're happy to keep the tax on the tea. That doesn't mean that during this time there isn't a lot of fighting, right? Again, some of our heroes are instigators. Now, we're not going to name names yet. We get to do that next time. But a lot of the wealthier landowners or wealthier merchants or lawyers or government officials will kind of instigate the poor and the middlings. And they will cause groups like the Sons of Liberty to become much more boisterous in their activities, to become much more, much more active. We can say it like that. They wouldn't have done things if it weren't for the agitation of some of the wealthier people in the colonies who really mostly felt the burden from the taxes, and they didn't like that. So there's some, they're playing the poorer and the middling classes in the colonies. Not everybody does that. Right, there are some fine, upstanding examples of great patriots who really are standing for principle. Benjamin Franklin, who we've already talked about being one, but not everybody is like Benjamin Franklin. All right, so the Boston Massacre, it's often made a big deal about in historical textbooks because some of the colonists made a big deal about it. The truth is, small fights like this, there were 5 people who were killed in 1770. The truth is that many things like this happened. Right? It's not like there was peace and peace and peace, and then the British troops come out and they kill 5 people, and oh, the world's coming to an end. That's not at all what it was like. There were fist fights all the time. There was rock throwing. There was shooting many times. But there constant skirmishes, constant fighting between groups like the Sons of Liberty or other zealous independents, and between the British soldiers, British government officials. The Boston Massacre is just one that kind of made the headlines, so to speak, because there were people who felt like they could use it to stoke the fires of rebellion. But I just put that in there. We might talk more about the Boston Massacre next time. I put that in there so that we could see that even though Lord North is trying to compromise, there are some people on both sides who find compromise unacceptable. And so we've already reached that point. At this point in 1770, most Americans are loyal to the empire. I couldn't give you a breakdown because we didn't do those types of polls back then. Just most Americans are loyal to the empire, including people like Benjamin Franklin. Franklin wanted to find a way for the colonies and the empire to exist together, peacefully. He didn't want conflict. He knew what conflict was like. He knew it was bad, and he wanted to keep the colonies prosperous. He wanted to keep the colonies happy and wealthy, and he thought that being part of the British Empire was the way to do that. He suggested making a new state out of the colonies and keeping the king. Very much like the Commonwealth system they have today, where Canada is a state and Australia is a state, and they still have the same monarch. Benjamin Franklin was way ahead of his time in lots of areas. This is a smashing idea. The problem is they don't like it over in England. And they are so entrenched, many of the MPs or the government officials are so entrenched in the idea that the colonies have to submit to Parliament that they fail to see that this would have been the way in 1770 to keep the empire together. Right? They weren't talking about breaking the empire up. He was talking about giving the colonies rule over themselves, and then they would still be part of the British Empire. With same king, it didn't work out for a wide variety of reasons. And this is going to take us on the road ultimately to rebellion. At this point, the colonists have resisted twice major actions of Parliament, and Parliament has had to back off. Parliament's going to get tired of backing off, and they're going to push and push and push until something finally snaps, and we're going to wind up with open rebellion and people fighting. The Parliament and the King want authority over the colonies, which is understandable. They're the one paying the bill. They're the one running the empire. They should, in their mind, have control over the colonies. The colonists don't see it that way. Some of them don't. They feel like they should have control over their own colonies, their own lives, and their own livelihoods, and some of them are willing to fight for it. So eventually, that's going to lead us to this, which will be the Continental Congress in 1776 that will declare independence from Great Britain. That's what we're going to start talking about next time. We're probably going to get up to 1776 and start moving into the movement for independence in the American colonies. I hope this is helpful. If you got any questions, send them along.